So if we could just start off with your name, your date and place of birth, and your current status, please.
Oh my God, am I at the commissariat already? My name is Paul Werner. I have a number of pseudonyms. For some reason, the CIA knows me as Bish, B-Y-S-H-E. Others know me by such names as Hoi Polloi Cassidy, Martha Studrat, and a few others. I was born February 12th, 1948 in New Haven, Connecticut. Anything else?
What's your current status?
My official current status is retired from many years in the museum industry, the art historical industry, and others, but in fact I am very much active as the editor of Void, an online journal. Also, I'm the publisher of the Orange Press, have been since 1973. It started out as an anarchist press. I've written about that. And actually at this point, I am mostly involved in a project to research, translate, and document the culture of what is called Red Vienna, that is the culture of interwar Viennese democratic socialism and its opponents.
Very good. Can you tell me a little bit about your upbringing and your education, please?
Yes, that leads directly into the subject. I was in Europe from age 5-ish to the fateful year of 1968. From 1959, I was in France. 1962, I think it was, I'd better check my notes. I was in at the Lycée Henri IV in Paris. I was there until 1965, was doing quite well. And then I dropped out of the Lycée Henri IV. That's an interesting story. I think it's very, very relevant to 68, so let me tell the story. I was having a lot of issues, among other things, with a very oppressive political and social culture in France. And in 1968, in the fall, September, I guess, I attended my first philosophy class at the Lycée Henri IV. The teacher, as one does, introduced the topic by telling us what philosophy was and went through his story of philosophy and so forth, and then concluded with the great narrative, which to him illustrated what philosophy was. It's from Alfred de Vigny's Grandeur et Servitude Militaire, the passage where this soldier in 1815, French officer, takes a camp by surprise, which is occupied by Russian soldiers, and murders a 16-year-old nobleman, Russian nobleman, in his sleep. And our professor triumphantly concluded that this is what philosophy is about. You take life as it comes, and if it means you're going to murder a 16-year-old kid in his sleep, he said with a wink and a smile towards us, well, that's the meaning of life. And I looked around and looked at my the other students who are busy writing down, will that be on the test? Philosophy is murdering kids in their sleep. They seemed happy with it. That was the last day I spent in philo, or for that matter, in French lycée, and I don't think I have too many regrets for that.
And what did you think of the French education system?
Hey, I went to the Lycée Henri IV, okay? You know, I think it was incredible. It just changed my life for me. I mean, you know, I still live by it. it's obvious that that if you go to a place like this, Derrida is just another explication de texte. I mean, it was terrific. Did I enjoy it? Obviously not. But I'm tremendously grateful for what it gave me. And also, I should say, by the way, I mean, at the time, and I think this has changed greatly, there really was an enormous amount of intellectual and political exchange. I mean, I met my first Nazi there, which was not too much fun, but then again, there were a lot of other opposing currents. It was just very vibrant. I have no problems with that. And again, I learned an enormous amount. I still live by it. It made me much of what I am. As a continuum, by the way, and perhaps this is another funny illustration, at one point, a little before that, I decided to, somebody decided to have classes in acting or to set up a theater troupe. So I went for the audition, and, this person who was auditioning wasn't even listening to me. It didn't bother me too much, because after I dropped out, and after a few rough years, as one would have, more like a rough year, I ended up being in the repertory, or more accurately, started out as a walk-on at the Théâtre National Populaire under Georges Wilson. So they may have known about Latin, but clearly at the Lycée Henri IV, they didn't know too much about acting. So basically, I was a member of the CGT and had joined the repertory at the Théâtre National Populaire when 68 got involved with me. I had first performed in the Martin Walser play, Chêne et Lapin, Angora, what's it called in German? The Eiche und Angora. And then we were starting on the Sartre play, The Devil and the Good Lord, Le Diable et le Bon Dieu, which was to play at the Avignon Theatre Festival in the summer of '68, when, I became aware of the uprising of May '68.
So what were you doing in 1968? What was your employment? What was your status?
Well, I was at the TNP, so I was employed. I had my carte de travail. I was part of, actually, it's an interesting issue. I had a carte de travail, and I was starting to be informally repertory, because once you were part of the team at the TNP, you could stay there for as long as you wanted. But I guess I was one of the early forms of what was to become the intermittent du travail, the part-time cultural workers who, as you know, have been very, very active in trying to change the system, cultural system, but of course their employment system within the very tightly controlled system of French culture.
Okay, so before we get on to how you experienced the events, would you say that you could feel something coming before it did? Or was it?
Yeah, on several levels, and I alluded to one of them briefly. There's some aspects of being in France in the early '60s that need to be emphasized. And here, a nod to a colleague, if I may. The only historian I know who really captures the mood is Herbert Luetti, France Against Herself. He's the only one I know of that talks at great length about the system of the passage à tabac, the fichier, the psychic violence in France in the early '60s was incredible. I have to say the psychic violence in France is no joke today, but we all worked under that. A number of years I asked a historian, it was a kind of intuition I had. I said, do you suppose the massacre of Sharon in February of 1962 had an influence on the outbreak of 68? He said, absolutely. And that had been my intuition all along. Tell you a really minor story, but which illustrates this. Sometime it must have been in the winter of 68, I forget when. I'm walking down the street. I'm a young kid. I buy a beignet or something, who knows what. It comes wrapped in a piece of paper. I eat the beignet and then, okay, bad boy, I throw the piece of paper in the gutter. Somehow a cop sees me and makes a whole production of ordering me to put it in a garbage can, or else he's going to this or that. And it's not really a wise political thought that May 68 happened because a cop told me to, put my paper in a garbage can, but these things were happening constantly. You get into, being beaten up by a worker because he thought, he'd broken something, and you were, there was just this tremendous sense of repression. Just really, it would lead to an explosion. It's inevitable.
And outside of sort of political or this idea of repression, was there any sense from a cultural perspective that things were beginning to change also?
Well, you're asking me to talk about the police riot right in front, or rather on top of the TNP on the Esplanade du Palais de Chaillot in February of 68. No, I was not there. Who knows where I was that particular moment, but yeah, if by culture you mean the culturati, the people that one respected and so forth, they'd been working for this all along. I mean, gosh, it was a kind of a small place, and this is something of which I really should not be too proud, but I actually, Sartre came to watch me rehearsing in Le Diable et le Bon Dieu, and I should say I'm not very proud of my performance that day, nor was he, by the way. But you knew who Sartre was. I remember, who was it? I mean, it's like I had a friend of Madeleine Renaud come visit me. Everybody knew who everybody was. And so, yeah, it was great. Listen, I mean, I grew up 2 minutes from the Librairie Maspero, okay, which was, I think, not infrequently being closed down. So even if you weren't reading Lacan, well, I wasn't reading Lacan, but I knew someone who claimed to be Lacan's girlfriend, and I could tell you lots of stories about his sexual performance, but he was probably lying anyhow, so it wouldn't make a difference. You kind of smelled this kind of possibility of resistance. Do you remember who Mouna was?
Mouna?
Mouna was this crazy guy who bicycled around and printed his little anarchist sheet all in caps and would put little graffiti up that said, Allez lisez Mouna. Or more to the point, and he would always get, I remember, and this is also really like the winter of 66, 67, 68, I remember that there were huge crowds. There were les monomes, remember? People thought that 68 was just another form of a student monome. I remember Mouna in the middle of a huge crowd of people talking. In the words of our latest Nobel Prize winner, there was music in the cafes at night and revolution in the air. And suddenly some student for a prank started pushing through the crowd saying, police, police, and everybody panicked and then laughed. I should also mention, because I think this is worth looking into, for some reason in the winter of 67, 68, there were graffiti all over for a group called Spartacus. I have no idea what this group was. I do have ideas, but I think we can get back to that at some other point. So yeah, there was a great sense that things were going to happen, and that's always interesting because one can then start pick up if or whether things are going to happen in the present.
Were you already politically or socially active and involved in activism prior to 1968?
Well, okay, let me make a general statement because I think it's worth reminding the young people, and I might even say the young faculty members, from at least 1789 to no doubt 1968, being political was taken for granted. And it's rather amazing, certainly in my classes in art history, that it's really assumed that people did not consider themselves political by definition. Just as a little side note, because it's a funny one, and part of my present research, if you want to find interesting thoughts about, say, performances of Handel on period instruments in 1924, I would think, well, you can read Die Rote Fahne, the journal of the German Communist Party, which has a review by Hans Eisler, as it turns out, of a performance of Handel. That's a very kind of Anglo-Saxon and specifically American fantasy that because culture is that of the upper classes, therefore its politicization is irrelevant. I mean, it's just a falsification of history. To answer your question more specifically, yeah, well, first of all, I had been very heavily involved in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. John Lewis, Congressman John Lewis, if you're listening to this, I didn't meet you either. Neither did Bernie Sanders, but we were still active. Sorry, Guy. So I was very involved with the Americans in Paris on various levels, although being much more French than they were, I tended to eventually gravitate away towards. I might have met with an organizing group or another at some point, a French organizing group. Yeah.
And were international events of any bearing on things?
Which ones would you be thinking of?
For example?
Well, yeah, I mean, Vietnam was a big issue among all students. First, of course, for me at least, there was the civil rights movement, but then some of the very same participants, young Americans, also a very lovely Brazilian. I've lost touch with him, and I wouldn't give you his name because it's his own business, but we were involved in the Vietnam, in the anti-war movement. It was fairly, I won't say friendly, but certainly ran into Mary, what's her name? Jolis, Mrs. Jolis a few times and so forth. Yeah, absolutely. And by the way, I mean, if you were involved in this, then you ran into les flics a lot because the French had their own how do you say, ils avaient leur propre, leur marron à tirer du feu eux-mêmes, ou à faire tirer du feu. And you certainly were being watched by the French cops, in addition to the CIA, in addition to the few others. So you were very aware of what was going on politically, no doubt about it.
And often when we talk about the causes of these events or try to have some understanding, we talk about the idea of a generation clash. Was that something that was evident at the time, or is that something we think of?
That's something you made up. I first started I first started being aware of what was going on in the Latin Quarter because I lived on Rue du Cardinal de Lemoine, and I was coming home. I would be coming home from rehearsals at midnight. Say I came home. Well, first of all, I had a girlfriend, or would have liked girlfriend, who got busted and thrown out on May 3rd when the cops closed down the Sorbonne. So I heard from her. Then on May 10th, I was coming back from rehearsal, and the bus stopped. I couldn't cross the Seine, and there were solid lines of CRS blocking me. There was a third moment where I forget the date, where I was by the Rue de Rennes, not far from the Odeon, and interesting, des lacrymos and so forth. But the thing to remember is when we really started getting aware of this, our elders, the professionals in the theater, were immensely supportive. I mean, Vilson, we'd be rehearsing. Georges Vilson would say, well, you see in this scene, these guys are the good guys and those guys, c'est les flics. It was understood that the flics were bad. Vilson, as you may know, had had a lot of interesting run-ins with de Gaulle. And so, yeah, the quote elders were enormously encouraging. I mean, it was really not that, the grown-ups, yeah, they were joining us for the most part. Not a generational thing at all.
Okay, so I know you've already mentioned some of this, but can you talk me through how you started to become aware something was happening?
Well, as I said, when your girlfriend complains, or would-be girlfriend complains of being roughed up, you start hearing about that. It's not surprising because this kind of tension has been going on for a while. When you see that there's these riots and so forth. But, the important thing is I remember standing in front of the TNP on the Place de Chaillot, and we were all discussing this. Some of the senior actors, people who'd been acting and, total professionals for like 30, 40 years, come in and say, what you kids are doing, keep it up. And we're all talking, and we're not talking about, revolution in the abstract. I mean, we're talking about how we need reforms, okay? We're talking about how we need reforms in our profession, okay? Now, this is another area that really, I think, is left, is kind of not covered enough. The Assemblée Générale, what did they call, Action Révolutionnaire, people getting together and talking. People were getting together and talking before this. Once May 13 approaches, they get together and talk about the need for reforms within the profession. And I remember, I believe it was before the 13th, I'm pretty sure. I remember there were several large assemblages of professionnels du spectacle. And I'm not talking just about the kids. I'm talking, for instance, about people who had been already demanding reforms when Langlois was fired from the Cinémathèque, etc., etc. In fact, I remember specifically, these were large assemblies, okay? I mean, probably 1,000 people in the main theater of the TNP, as I recall. I remember specifically Claude Berry, who had been one of the people protesting the Cinémathèque event, making this speech. And, I mean, what did I know about these things? But somebody next to me, just said, this is reformist nonsense, he's just making a fool of himself by demanding that the government do X and Y, which mostly involved giving him more money. And the point here is that people were clearly saying it's not enough anymore to make reformist demands, okay? And, you know, I also should add, perhaps she's out there, that the last time I saw another friend of mine, Christine de Rivière, she was at a General Assembly in the Sorbonne talking about reforming the psychological, you know, the psychologists and so forth. And Christine, if you're there, I sure would like to see you again. I'd like to know what happened to you. There was a great deal of that. And, you know, the kids throwing stuff is, that's just for the journalists.
We can discuss that more later. So how would you say you got involved? What did you do? Did you attend meetings? Did you join groups? Did you?
Yeah, before the 13th, since I was of the CGT and since I was a, you know, intermittent, a group of us decided that we would try and coordinate among all the groups. So I'm running around to various places, basic listening and trying to, you know, see if we can get some kind of consistent line on the reforms that must be made to ensure, well, what is still not being ensured in Paris to this day, which is some kind of independence for les intermittents, part-time cultural workers, whether they are models for art studios or actors or people who, you know, sword swallowers on the street. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because what intervenes is May 13th. And, well, as we all know, May 13th is the huge manif where people haven't yet started at the Bastille and already they're at Place d'Enfer Rochereau. And I'm walking along, and again, being a kind of independent-minded person, I'm not part of any group, I'm just walking. And I end up at Place d'Enfer Rochereau, and it's a rather interesting situation where the union rep or whatever has the microphone, and he's telling people it's time to go home. You've made your point, yada, yada. And meanwhile, people are shooting off in all kinds of directions. Nobody quite knows what directions they're taking, but this I did not witness at that particular minute. I read somewhere that at this point, Cohn-Bendit is in the crowd saying, "Suivez-moi, suivez-moi," has no idea where they're going to suivre him. But I did end up following Cohn-Bendit's group, and for some reason, I'm sure unknown to him, I can't figure it out to this day, we end up marching towards the Champ de Mars. Are we going to cross over and take over the Élysée? Are we going to take over He doesn't know. And we finally end up in the Champ de Mars. I think it was the Champ de Mars, I don't know. Somewhere by the École Militaire, and we're all sitting down, and somebody comes up and says, "Cohn-Bendit is going to tell you," and Cohn-Bendit says, "I'm going to tell you because, you know, you don't tell me what I know," but he doesn't know what he knows. And I think at that point he starts improvising that, oh, well, we're going to occupy the factories. So I assume he's heard that people have already started occupying the factories. So everybody goes back to their factories, or at least the equivalent. And that's the beginning of the next phase.
So how did you experience the next phase then? How did that play out on a day-to-day?
The next phase was a lot of running around. I think my most important and interesting part of the next phase was on, let me see what the date was. Yeah, May 15th. Okay, that's where the fame part happens, if you want to call it that. May 15th is, again, I'm being a representative somehow of the intermittent du spectacle, and I hear that they're discussing invading the Odeon. So I go to Saint-Cyr, and there's a meeting, an assemblée, a comité d'action, whatever they want to call it, and not that many people, maybe 100, 200, and they're discussing we're going to take over the Odeon, yada, yada, yada. I think it's a really stupid idea. So there's a CGT representative in the room, you know, on pourrait faire ça, da, da, da. So I go over to him, I say, you know, mais c'est complètement con ce qu'ils veulent faire. It's going to divide workers and students. On dirait qu'ils le font exprès. I didn't say that, but I probably thought about it. And the CGT guy says, oh, don't worry, you know, I'm just going to throw in a few totally nihilistic proposals, and that will keep them arguing all night. Yeah, right. Famous last words. Well, it might have, for all I know, because next morning, the 16th, I wake up and I find out that they have taken over the Odeon, but I've read Benak's book, which, you know, is the authority on these issues. And I get the suspicion that what happened was that there were two rival groups planning to take over the Odeon, and the other group decided to act. Maybe they didn't have their CGT representative to throw in nihilistic ideas. In any case, that evening I go to the Odeon, I go to the back entrance. I had no problem getting in because, you know, first of all, I knew some of the people who were these, they were these very marginal actors, and I mean that in both senses. The literal sense is they were people I knew from acting school who you were talking about political. I remember one guy who was in some whatever production about the Vietnam War and telling me how, you know, he was going to pretend to shoot at the audience with a fake machine gun and they'd be really scared. And I'm like, so I may have made this up. I think I transferred this from reading it's, I think, in Flaubert. I remember the guy wearing a casque de pompier, but I'm not sure. Anyhow, he's guarding the door, so obviously he's going to let me in. I should say, by the way, in passing, and this is an important thing, not a situ inside, okay? I mean, not a friggin' situ inside, ever, 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 okay? So anyhow, I get into the Odeon, and I go onto the apron, onto the stage, and there's Cohn-Bendit, and there in a semicircle is Madeleine Renaud, Jean-Luc Barrault, Jean-Louis Barrault, Patata, all sitting on the floor on the stage, and Barrault is kind of being soft shoeing it. Madeleine Renaud looks like she wants to bite somebody. And Cohn-Bendit is giving this whole speech about how we're bourgeois who, you know, it's exactly, I mean, he could have been quoting from David. Depuis trop longtemps, les artistes se sont traînés devant les bourgeois, devant les élites qu'ils encensaient, etc., etc. So we're going to have a new theater out of no, you know, whatever. And I should say this was the second time that I had been close enough to send Cohn-Bendit flying with a nice kick in the pants. And I think that's my only regret, that I missed both occasions. And, you know, we're both getting old, so I'm not sure I'll have the energy to do it next time I see him. It's one of my only regret. Okay. So the Odeon's occupied, and I'm basically running around. Spent a little bit of time at the Odeon where, you know, these guys are wandering around, just no knowledge of how a theater works, no knowledge of, you know, who we might work with, just like chatting, you know, the kind of stuff that Michel de Certeau found wonderful. Oh, they're all chatting away. La prise de parole with nothing to say. But meanwhile, again, there's a lot of people who have a prise de parole with a lot to say. And I'm running back and forth and listening to that and participating in a few manifs, you know, one along the Rue de Rennes. I remember going to the manif, the big one on the Rive Droite, I believe it was on May 30th, when it looked like de Gaulle was going to run off. And again, like my very respected colleague, Jonathan Israel, I was not very far from the Bourse when it went up in flames. I'm sorry, Dr. Israel, I much admire your work, but you say the fire was started by Trotskyites. I don't think so, okay? But maybe it's best not to go too far in that direction because there's a lot of rumors there. Anyhow, next question.
How did you experience the strike on a day? How did that impact on your daily life? The strike.
Well, I didn't get home much. I was running around a lot. I remember, sleeping in people's sixth-floor, one-room apartments, which weren't fashionable then, and eating a lot of pommes frites because, again, I mean, a lot of things were closed. It was hard to get around. It was hard to get food sometimes, and there was a lot of chaos. I have a wonderful experience. I'd gone to the Palais de Chaillot briefly, which was occupied, and also here I might say that even though I did not spend a great deal of time in the occupied Palais de Chaillot, occupied by the workers, by the stage workers, it was tremendously moving. It was an experience I will never forget, to be exposed to a totally different way of organizing. And that is something I want to emphasize. Here's another aspect that I really think needs to be talked about more. One reason I respect Luetti, he's the only historian I know who mentions really in passing that there was a great deal of anarchist organizing within the trade unions in France. I think he's talking specifically about Boulogne-Billancourt, but it was apparent elsewhere. And here again, we have to be careful. If one tries to look up the history of, one would have to call it autonomous Marxism, or if you prefer, that might be the French term, it's the one I would use, anarcho-syndicalism, or simply anarchist organizing. It seems the official narrative is that it appears in Italy in the very late 60s, early 70s, Negri and others. This kind of organizing didn't grow out of a hat. That's why I mentioned the existence of the Spartacus group, whatever it was. What was their relationship to Pan-Curtian Workers' Council organizing? How much of that was that? We know there were a great number of Spanish and Italian workers in Boulogne-Billancourt and others, and certainly the Spanish workers, or even second-generation Spanish workers, knew their CNT organizing very, very well. And I think this has to be taken into account. There's an aspect of, quote, spontaneous organizing, which is not spontaneous at all. It means, once again, that workers are educated, they're not stupid. How could they survive if they were? And certainly they had a knowledge of how to organize, which really has been, so far as I know, passé sous silence. Let me mention also, as a concrete fact, that one of the young people who was arrested with me in Flins was a young worker from Turin, who was, I assume, expelled along with me. I don't know his name, I never found out, but clearly he must have been exposed to some types of Italian organizing thought. So I saw a little bit of that, and yeah.
We'll get on to how that happened at Flins for you, and I'll work through a few things that will lead up to that. So can you, one of the aspects that also perhaps falls into the category you've just mentioned is the attempts to forge links between students and workers, and the sort of dominant narrative is that didn't happen and it didn't succeed. Well, did you have any experience of that, and what would you say about it?
Again, those accounts are usually from the point of view of students, not workers, okay? Yes, we hear about the students going to, I guess it was Bianco, I forget, and being told to stay away. Yeah, well, I have no problem with that, okay? Because students did not really understand, nor would they understand, the specific situation of workers. In particular, the fact that students weren't too likely to be, say, shot, murdered, dumped in the Seine, the way workers would be. They had a great deal more to lose. So I don't see that as some kind of fundamental cultural difference. You know, a lot of these students, they were of a generation that was pretty close to the factory anyhow. You know, I have to say this because, you know, some of the viewers might not be aware. You know, Henri IV, if I mention Henri IV, now everybody knows that it's basically, you know, favored kids and all that. There were workers' kids at Henri IV, okay? So to me, it's just a practical issue. Yes, we workers are going to decide things for ourselves as a group. This is something that is totally beyond the comprehension of someone like Cohn-Bendit, not because he hasn't read the right books, but because basically he has this hierarchical obsession to lead. And they're saying that this is not how society must be reorganized. And that, for me, was the deepest, most profound lesson. And one of the benefits of thinking a little bit about this talk we're having is that in retrospect, I realized that my whole life since 68 has been really one of an organizer of that type. Not the leader of men that the media loves, but rather the person who, with his partner, once a crétin like Trump gets elected, is walking around a neighborhood in Florida talking to people and listening. And one does not learn that by aping Cohn-Bendit. One learns it by working with, say, theater people. I'm a stage electrician, so I know quite well what happens when you don't listen to the guy who at some point is going to be 30 feet above you in the air and unscrewing an object that weighs 100 pounds, and that's directly over your head. There's a different way of organizing and thinking as a group, and I had a glimpse of it in '68, and so help me, I never forgot it.
You mentioned earlier this notion of la prise de parole.
Yeah.
Why do you think that was such an important element in '68?
To whom?
To everyone, to the events of '68. I mean, is it true that everybody started speaking to each other and everyone spoke to their neighbors for the first time? And how could we explain that?
Excuse me, I've been speaking to my neighbors all along. I speak French, okay? You know, excuse me. Were people not? Well, again, here's a lovely little story, okay? And I don't know if that's proof of anything. I remember I had headed to the Palais de Chaillot, and I couldn't get it. I had also headed to see a friend of mine who was actually of the minor nobility, who was very encouraging because she said, yeah, I should join the Manif. I was already part of them. Anyhow, it turned out later that she had a relative who could pull strings for me because he was in the police department. we'll leave that for later. Anyhow, so I was trying to find my way back and hitchhiked with a bourgeois, and I sat in front of him and he's telling me, what he thinks, and he doesn't totally agree with me, with us young kids. He wasn't very old, by the way. But we had a really nice conversation. It was just like, yeah. And I've learned to have those conversations since. They're pretty darned useful. Okay, we don't agree, but what is the point in which we will no longer be able to talk in this friendly way? And until I started hearing otherwise, that is, until we were really turned against one another, much the way Trump has turned people against one another. People were talking a lot. They'd been talking before. They'd been talking in '67. It wasn't a problem about talking among ourselves. It was a problem about talking to the state. I mean, here again, this is something so fundamental that only by understanding how so fundamental it is can one understand how historians of the Kristin Ross variety and many others are busy hiding it. The difference between the commune of Kristin Ross or the commune of Proudhon, same difference, is not, some theory about organizing, is some theory about the state, okay? And we all knew the enemy was the state. How we felt one should go about changing things was where differences happened. No, people were talking a lot in '68. The thing that bothers me in retrospect about de Certeau is that la prise de parole becomes reified. That's what I was trying to say. It's as if talking is more important than talking about something specific. Well, there were a lot of people who were in love with watching themselves talk at the time. I shouldn't complain because I'm watching myself right now, but it wasn't too hard to tell the difference between those who were talking, because actually they thought one could reach something, one could reach action. And, it's never very hard to make the distinction, but it's a distinction one has to remember in every situation where one has to organize, Yes, thank you. I'm allowed to talk. Cause toujours. What was that poster that came out? La dictature, c'est ferme ta gueule. La démocratie, c'est cause toujours.
Okay, another question then. Do you consider the events of 1968 to have been violent?
You mean, was the state more violent than usual? No more than usual. Again, France is still an extremely violent place. So I think that, again, the reification of violence, which is absolutely common in any critique of the left, is just not interesting, It's just violence, what kind? Verbal violence, killing people, throwing Algerians into the Seine? What are we talking about here, Telling nice Vice President Pence that he should learn from the play he's just walked. Let's define violence.
So what did you think of the role of the police then?
You want me to talk about that? Well, let's define violence. I still have my copy somewhere of Le Livre Noir des Journées de Mai. Of course there was violence. I was at Flins just about the time that kid was thrown into the river. You're asking me if I believe that, first we were meant to believe that nobody was hurt. Really? Well, okay. Everything's on strike, including, of course, les croque-morts, and who knows what records are being kept. Nobody was killed. Oh, really? Interesting. According to Daniel Gordon, excuse me, something like 67% of the people busted in the Quartier Latin were Algerians. That's Algerians in addition to Moroccans. So let's just say a large percent, maybe 2/3 almost, were Maghrébins. And you really want to tell me that they were treated nicely? Come on. Come on. Of course. And of course, we know that at some point they considered bringing in the army, but thought quite rightly so that because the army was a lot of recruits, they weren't going to shoot. Absolutely. Of course. You know, one of the few wise things that Cohn-Bendit said was, well, the purpose of these manifs, if nothing else, is to show the true face of the regime. I mean, de Gaulle was close to a fascist, okay? I mean, it's, yeah, end of story, unless you have any follow-ups.
When you were active in Paris in '68, was there an awareness that similar movements were happening elsewhere in France, so out in the regions, or is that something that...
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah, a little bit. I remember hearing about stuff going on, I think in Nantes it was, and so forth. So yeah, we were aware. Again, you know, the myth that we're just a bunch of out-of-touch kids who don't know, you know, it's all happening in Paris. You know, it took historians, what, 200 years to figure out that things were happening in France during the French Revolution, so elsewhere in France.
Okay. Was there any sense during 1968 that what was happening in France was part of a larger transnational wave of revolt? You know, we know now with hindsight that 1968 was not limited to France, and les années 68 that stretches to many other countries. Was there a sense at the time that was the case?
Yeah. You know, I mean, again, there were, after all, I was technically a foreigner, and we knew about the Germans. Quite a few turned up in Paris. You know, let me rephrase this. The thing that we really knew was that we were not national. You know, we knew we were international. Is it exactly an accident that one of the things that helped us enormously was the Twitter of the day, I guess you could call it, which was the fact that the only radio station, as I recall, that was covering the events thoroughly was, if I recall correctly, Radio Luxembourg. Now, were they really in Luxembourg? I don't know, but it was symbolic at the very least.
Okay. What did you make of the performance of the political elite in '68? So de Gaulle, Pompidou, Mendes, France, Mitterrand, that.
Wasn't paying much attention to them, and I don't think too many people were. You know, Mitterrand. You know, we knew him mostly as. I think people just, at least from my point of view, people weren't interested in them. I don't recall, you know, that's me. I don't recall there being part of it, because basically the idea was, you know, you're going to represent us. We don't need it. I mean, it just, you know, naturally I read about what they had done or not done afterwards. Naturally, people knew Mendes France, and at least from my angle, respected him, knew Mitterrand and thoroughly disrespected him, but they were somewhere else. I don't recall ever seeing them. I don't recall, you know, and that's me. I know Mendes France did turn up and speak, but, you know, there was a slogan, remember, X avec nous. So you'd be marching, say I'm marching down the Rue de Rennes and I see my ex-shrink, who was a total jerk, and he's at a balcony, and, you know, the temptation to shout Dr. X avec nous, you know, just to really humiliate him, get him involved, was great. But that would be a way of saying, you're with us, we're not with you, okay? So, Mitterrand avec nous, ça nous fait une belle jambe. Okay.
And what did you think of de Gaulle?
You know, after a time, I learned to mildly respect the poor, smart guy. At least he was a smart fascist, you know. Oh, you know, people had contempt for him from way back. I could tell you stories, but they're stories that people made up, but maybe that's fair enough. De Gaulle and was it Konrad Adenauer? Well, they're going to have the big France and German alliance. And I'm standing on the Boulevard Saint-Michel, and there's this crowd of people because it's 5 o'clock and they're blocking, all the streets. And then we find out why we're there, which is that this fabulous cortege of CRS on motorcycles with their red, just gorgeous, come down the avenue. And it's just, and everybody cheers because it's like the 14 Juillet. And then De Gaulle and Adenauer, and it's like dead silence. Dead silence. People hated his guts.
Okay. What happened in Flins?
Okay. Let me get the dates down again because it gets a little bit messy. Let's see. Flins is June 7th. So we know by then that the expulsions from the factories have begun, and this is the where it comes to a crunch. It's no longer about the students, it's about supporting the workers, Yeah, workers should support the students. We know that already. How about you guys support us? And I don't mean just you come in parade and tell us what to do at the factory. It means you actually join in protecting the factories. And I can tell you, again, I remember going to the Palais de Chaillot, which was in the 6e, and the guys were scared. They were occupying the factory, and they figured they could get into some rough time. These are tough people. So we know that there are pitched battles going on in the fields in Flins, about 20 miles outside of Paris. There's this huge manifestation de soutien at the Gare Saint-Lazare. So I go. And somebody, it might have been Geismar, I really wouldn't remember, is giving this wonderful speech about how we're all with the workers and all that. So now let's all go home because in any case the trains aren't running and it's a trap and we'll all get beaten up, kind of like the workers are getting beaten up. So I'm an inquisitive type. So I go onto the train platform, are the trains running? Well, the trains are running, but they're not taking tickets. So you get a free ride to Flins. It's probably going to be a one-way ride, but it's free. I'm thinking, I think more people should be made aware of this. So I'm heading off the platform when I run into my friend David Diop. Diop is the son of the founder of Présence Africaine. We went to Lycée Henri IV together, really got along well because he had to deal with the racists and I had to deal with the anti-Semites, and it's perfect. And he's there, if I recall, with his girlfriend, and we say, hey, let's all go to Flins. Well, we get on the train. It's not too particularly occupied, and lots of free seats. We get to Flins, the train stops, and we look out the window, and it's solid CRS along the platform. Well, how about we get off next station? So we get off next station and decide to walk through the fields back to Flins. So we walk through the fields, there's helicopters hovering, it's all very dramatic. Get to Flins, find a barn somewhere because by then it's nightfall, and decide to have a little sleep because we're going to need it tomorrow. And in the middle of the night, Diop's girlfriend gets into a fight with him and walks out. Can't blame her. So in the morning, it's okay, where's our café au lait and croissant? So we walk down the street, and there's a guy who looks just like a worker, you know, he's got a little worker's casquette, so he must be. And he says, oh, you want to find the others? Fine. And he leads us directly to a bunch of CRS. So they put us in a shed, which I suppose was on the grounds of the factory, I don't recall. It's a small shed with a lot of people in it. So many that basically it's not very easy to find a place to sit down. The doors are closed, it's June, and there's not much air and people are fainting. So we take turns basically knocking on the door so that the CRS can open and we can say, excusez-moi, est-ce que, which of course they're going to say, va te faire foutre, and slam the door, but it'll get enough air in so that the comrades can breathe at least. Well, this lasts for a number of hours, and then we are taken in panier salade into Paris. They must have been really scared of us because I recall that there were 3 of us and 3 CRS facing us on facing benches. So the CRS facing me just kind of decides to take a nap while we're going into Paris. There's a young kid, he really is pretty skinny and looking, facing the CRS in the middle. And the CRS in the middle at some point starts in, alors tu nous appelles SS, hein? Tu dis qu'on est des SS, hein? Well, let me tell you something. If you think we're SS, I want to tell you what I would do to you if I were an SS. And he goes through this whole litany of, I'd do this, I'd castrate you, I'd da-da-da-da-da. And it's going on and on and on. And the other CRS are snoozing. And we pull into Bourgeon prison, and he says, but fortunately, we're under orders not to do this, so you got lucky this time. And this kid is like a total wreck. So they put us in cells, and by the way, as background, I wasn't there, so I'm not allowed to be proof of anything, but the story I had heard at the time was that if you got into Bourgeon, you would have the pleasure of having them kick your balls until, you know, whatever, or women were being raped. And again, you can watch or read the Black Book of Mabe, which of course we know it never happened, for what that's worth. So I'm brought to Bourgeon, locked up for a little while, served the most un-French sandwich I've ever tasted, and then brought before a commissaire. Commissaire says, and here, by the way, I should mention, technically I had a reason to be at Flins, which was that I had some kind of credits as a Red Cross, you know, basically new first aid and stuff like that. And, you know, it was a valid reason to be there, at least for me, but I never got around to answering it. The guy says, pourquoi étiez-vous Flins? You know, he immediately says, ah oui, vous alliez aux fraises, hein? And then as he writes, he writes down, and I really have to quote it exactly. Nez busqué, cheveux frisés, mine patibulaire, expulsion immédiate. For those of our friends and listeners who don't know what this means, it's total dog whistle for Jew, okay? So they put me again in jail for a while. And I stayed there overnight, I believe. I forget exactly if I was heard the following day or that night. So the next day, I'm brought into the Central Police Station. I forget what it's called. You'll forgive me, in the Ile de la Cité. And there it gets interesting. And again, it gets interesting. I've this first, this is June 9th, this first, this witness account has been distorted by the fact that I had some discussions and interviews, and then further, criticisms of David Gordon when he interviewed me for his book, which is called Immigrants and Intellectuals, okay? And the issue is what part anti-Semitism played. It's a very long topic and obviously a very important one to me, but the interesting issue here, where I think David was really, did not have sufficient information to address it, was it anti-Semitic? Absolutely. Was it illegal to just throw me out? Yes, as well. Was this attitude really, shall we say, culturally spread, as David thinks, within the police? No. What had happened was that there were raging fascist SS, I can say it now, within the police force, as there are within any police force. But as in any police force, there were people who were still trying to do their job without going overboard. And so perhaps the reason I was brought to the Ile de la Cité, well, after a little while, sitting around and being lectured by a cop about how well this would end up on our, in the Interpol or some such nonsense, our careers would be ruined as cops for sure. I was brought in for interrogation, but by a few very smart commissaires who, just, I don't know, me tirer les verres du nez. They wanted to find out if I really was, if I'd thrown bombs or anything. And I assured them that no, I hadn't. And they basically sent in their report. And this I learned later. The report was basically, okay, these people really should not necessarily be expelled. I mean, I had a carte de séjour, I was a regular worker, I was like, a few years from citizenship if I had wished it. What eventually happened, and I learned this later, was that these guys sent the pile of the dossier to the new Minister of the Interior, Salon, who just looked at it and said, "Expulsez-moi cette racaille." And of course, as we know, again, I obviously was not there, spent a good deal of time saying the same thing in the Assemblée Nationale, because of course that was totally illegal. Now as then, by the way, guys, if you ever get busted in France. Anyhow, so they basically told me to, that I had a few days, I had 3 months to appeal, a month to appeal and send me forth, Well, the interesting thing that happened then was I'm leaving the commissariat and, foot flic sees me and he goes up to me and said, "Vous êtes juif, n'est-ce pas?" I said, "Oui, bien sûr." And he says, "Oh, ça vous a pas porté bonheur, hein?" And then just walks away, just une petite remarque. And then 30 seconds later, actually that did not happen 30 seconds later. It happened when I was brought in before expulsion. A couple of flics in a car, des commissaires en civil, lean out the window and start calling me a sale juif and worse, okay? So basically I am then released and, go back to the TNP, go back home a bit, go back to my mother and say, okay, we have to organize a legal defense here, stuff like that. And for the next day or so, what I don't know is that Marcelin has signed this order and that there's a couple of gorilles who are following me around. I didn't meet up with them until a little bit later, but it must have been funny because apparently they went to the TNP and asked Georges Wilson, to turn over this anarchist, Bolshevist, terrorist, etc. And of course, with his deep love of cops that Villesson had, I can only imagine what the sequel was. So anyhow, I'm, going here and there, going back to my place and going back to the theater, and they caught up with me eventually at my parents' place. And then I'm taken back to the commissariat, where again I encounter these charming French anti-Semites. And they put me in a car and drive me to, I guess, Orly. I remember passing the still occupied Sorbonne, and for a minute having thinking of jumping out the car and running for help. But we get there. They put me on a plane to New York. It was kind of funny because the strike at Air France had just been broken just a few days ago. So these two gorilles, who are not the most sophisticated people in the world, put me in a seat, and they say to the flight attendant, watch out for that one. And the flight attendant looks at them and says, looks at me and says, "T'as un parachute, mon vieux?" I say, no. He said, bon. And then, of course, they put me in first class. They apologize. This, I think, answers some of your questions about La Culture, and I'll return to another small point like that. They apologize that they can only show, that the movie showing is Angélique et le Roi, and, that it's a little bit below my my political whatever. Very nice first class lunch. Great conversation with the other flight attendant, and want to share a cigarette or whatnot. And anyhow, it was really a lovely flight all in all. But it reminded me of another little event that happened, which it's the last line in my doctoral dissertation, and I think it answers some of your questions, cultural divides. It was really heartbreaking. When I went to Flins, like any good mini intellectual qui se respecte, I brought a book, a paperback. I still have it. It's Le Théâtre et son double by Artaud. And so when I'm arrested, when I'm brought to Beaujon, I'm being searched by the flic, and this young flic finds my copy of Artaud. And he walks over to the commissaire, and he's really upset. He says, alors, commandant, il a un livre. Est-ce qu'on peut lui laisser son livre? Est-ce qu'on peut lui laisser son livre? That stuck with me forever, okay? Any questions, thoughts?
Oh, that's nice. So, what happened? So, what happened when you got to New York? Was that you done with France, or?
You mean I went back briefly in early '73?
Okay, right. So you could, yes.
Very briefly, and I had gone through '68 to '73, practically not leaving New York. Living in very rough circumstances, briefly homeless, hanging with drug dealers and druggies, mostly actually in East Harlem. So, eventually get back to college. I just finished my degree in end of '72, beginning of '73, and I decided to check out what's in France. Had never been physically hurt in New York, and first thing is I get beaten up by an Algerian on the Boulevard Saint-Michel. So okay, I think the violence thing is still there. I think the more interesting issue was my mother lived basically on the Place Saint-Michel, and she says, look, there's this guy around the corner on the Rue Gilles Coeur, who he's been very supportive. He wants to know what you're doing. He says he has friends and he can maybe help you reinsert yourself. So fine, I went to see the guy. He ran a gallery. And the guy starts talking to me and he starts going, so yeah, I know the right kind of people. If, I mean, we all know it wasn't you who was involved. It was the leaders, right? You were led on by your leaders, right? Who were your leaders again? Fuck you, Well, this is an important story because, the old narrative of, oh yeah, all these Cohn-Bendit types, let's say it, the pressure to, excuse me for saying it, to have been one of these students who were just hanging out, but now I've grown up, there was a lot of pressure, and there still is, and it was thorough, okay? So naturally, it didn't look like a good time to return to Paris, and to tell you the truth, it still doesn't look like a good time.
Can you remember how you felt when the events were brought to a conclusion with the Gaullist victory in June?
Well, yes, I can tell you two stories because they dovetail very, very nicely. I have obviously friends in Paris, young friends. And by the way, I should mention, one of the reasons I'm happy I never went back was, yeah, a lot of them ended up dead, including Diop. Exactly how Diop died, I still don't know, but I know how others died. And so, yeah. Now, I had one such friend, and we were writing back and forth after de Gaulle was elected or whatever happened to him. And he had a memorable quote. He said, these people were born with a boot up their ass. They've lived all their lives with a boot up their ass. And they will die with a boot up their ass. And he said, the thing they're most frightened of, he said, let me requote it. It's a beautiful sentence. These people were born with a boot up their ass. They've lived all their lives with a boot up their ass. And they are terrified that anybody would take the boot out of their ass. Well, a number of years later, I was driving around with a character by the name of Jimmy the Debaucher. Jimmy the Debaucher was a labor organizer in America, and I told him the story about these people who lived with a boot up their ass, and he said, they're afraid their guts will fall out. Need I say more?
Can you recall how your family felt with your involvement in 68 and obviously the difficulties you faced when you were expelled?
Oh, my family? Well, let me put it this way. My family felt that they were the heroes of the story. Okay. I'm sure if you want to interview my mother, you can call her up. She's getting a little bit dim in the memory, but I think actually I shouldn't complain too much because afterwards she wandered over to the what's it called, the École des Beaux-Arts, and explained to the students there that, of course, they did not want their posters that they produced to be used, to be used as collector's items. As you know, even to this day, it's not terribly easy to buy those posters because they were not to be sold. I mean, they were not to be part of the capitalist system of production. But however, since after all, I had done my duty for La Révolution, and so she got a huge pile of posters. I'm glad to say I got a couple. But she was quite busy visiting the, the churches groups and whatnot on Long Island, talking about what it felt like to be part of the revolution. I would suggest, I don't want to be too much of to rat out my mom, But I would suggest, if you want a good sense of what that was about, if you want a really terrible sense, I've never read the thing, but nobody likes it. What's it called? The Merry Month of May by James Jones, who lived basically 2 minutes from where I lived, which is all about, you know, the crazy kids screaming and yelling. I often thought I might try reading the damn thing, see if I could sue him, but then you could also read somebody who was definitely of my parents' generation, whom I knew quite well, who was definitely not a revolutionary. Now I've forgotten her name. She wrote a lot, if she's still alive, I think she is, for the New Yorker. Gosh, what is her name? Forget, you know, she's a New Yorker type writer, but she wrote some wonderful stuff about May 68, which is not at all based on her sympathies. She had no sympathies whatsoever for it, but she's a smart person who senses what's going on with people like myself and with their families. So rather than asking me to be objective about the thing which people spend their whole lifetimes trying to be objective about, ask her. Why don't I remember her name? She's a Canadian writer who, yeah, the name will come back. She's a very well-known American-Canadian writer for the New Yorker.
Mavis Gallant, no?
Mavis Gallant, yeah, Mavis Gallant, yeah, exactly, yeah. And you were quite well indeed.
Yeah, I've got a few things by her, yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
How did you perceive the impact of the events on France at the time, and has this changed as the years have passed with consequences?
How they've changed? You know what? I would refer you again to Lueti, because Lueti is the guy who says things absolutely have to change. They can't go on like this. And the things that haven't changed, according to that Lueti says must change, haven't changed. One of them, of course, is the power system. Hasn't changed at all, has only gotten worse. At least in my day, if you were a worker's son, you might still aspire to go to Henri IV. Now you're just, you know, it's all les satrapes and so forth. So I would say from that point of view, from the point of view of what you call the politics and the social system, things have not changed. From the point of view of the, say, the civic society, I think things have gotten worse. But then again, civil society, by definition, adapts with much greater speed. And I would not be terribly surprised if tomorrow we have another May 68 or an Occupy or whatnot in France. That's civil society. You know, I hate to sound like a sentimental Marxist. I don't mind sounding like a Marxist at all. It's the sentimental part that I'd rather avoid. You know, people we've already touched on this a little bit with my suggestion that some kind of truth about organizing came out of the working class. That's not the case. It's simply that so long as you have a situation like in 1984, where the working class is pretty much left to its own because nobody gives a hoot about them, their ways of thinking will grow out of the relations of production. And, you know, it's not that there's this miracle that everybody with a worker's cap is going to somehow have a worker's consciousness, but there is the reality that consciousness does grow out of historic situations, and that these historic situations change extremely fast, extremely fast. So, you know, what you're asking me is the following, because again, this is one of the things that has marked me most deeply. I'm, whatever, maybe 12 years old, probably, yeah, 12, 13. I'm sent to Colonie de Vacances, which is somewhere in the Alps. For an indifferent reason, I'm sent there by myself. So basically I take the train and then I take the bus. The bus drops me off somewhere in the mountains in front of a farmyard. I'm supposed to wait for a car to pick me up. I start talking to the woman in the farmyard. I'm a little kid and she's a farmer. And within 10 seconds, well, 10 minutes, whatever, she makes me understand that she's proud of her son who is going to be a teacher. It doesn't take her too long to basically tell me that, she understands the source of my arrogance, but that it's misplaced. She's just a lovely person, very smart. It stuck with me forever. Now, there's people like that everywhere. They're getting a little bit hard to find, but they are there. And, sometimes there's fewer of them in one country and more of them in another. But they're there by default. And I have no doubt that there are still a few left in Paris. I've met quite a few, actually. And they may not necessarily be the ones shouting loudest, but that's precisely why they're the people with whom I'd rather be.
Do you think your experience of these events had an influence on how you understand France?
Yeah. That's why I still cringe when I have to go there. I mean, I'm getting used to it by now, but I think I'll be cringing again. I mean, let me answer your question more directly. I'm halfway through a longish article. I don't know what I'll do with it when I'm finished. I posted some of it on and mentioned some of it, and many of the readers on H France were kind enough to read it, which is called Nuremberg sur Seine. And first I returned to, of course, the transforming thing. Sartre was right. It's the anti-Semitism that makes the Jew. And I am still flabbergasted by the depth of racism, anti-Semitism, and oppressiveness that exists and has existed for a long time in France. I am not about to blame the French people, but should I ever finish this article, I would really like to point out in a very German-speaking Adorno-like way how deeply Nazism is really totally in line, not simply with the Enlightenment. That's, that's a more complicated issue, but definitely with the formation of the French state. I mean, definitely. And it's why I'm so grateful to Jonathan Israel for clarifying the strains and stresses in Enlightenment thought that lead to that. But yeah, as far as I'm concerned, the French state is basically fascist fearing on deism. And I'm aware of that. And I imagine a few French people would be more aware of it if they weren't aware that so much as saying it could land you with 6 months in jail.
How would you summarize the impact of your experience of 1968 from a personal or political perspective?
Clarify?
So, what impact did 68 have on you personally, politically?
I don't understand. I thought the personal was political.
Okay, well, that's why it's personal or political. It's the same thing. So what
Can you be more specific? I mean,
well, if you were asked to summarize the impact.
Okay, I would tell you that I found out that the political is personal and that the personal is political. Works for you?
Yeah, can you elaborate on that?
Well, let's see. Where I am right now is I'm, again, very much, it's interesting. What I'm doing right now, I'll get to your question. What I'm doing right now is I'm very interested in Red Vienna, remember? And then that's where you try to draw connections between, say, Wittgenstein, Freud, a guy like Max Adler, Austro-Marxist, who probably had some influence on the French, the events of May 68, because Maspero was publishing stuff about Adler. So there you get into the situation of a, shall we say, a political epistemology, which it seems to me is extremely important here. And yeah, I think the wake-up call of May 68, for those of us who didn't want to fall asleep again, was precisely that our subjectivity was not not only not so objective after all, but had to be corrected through something else than the Kantian epistemology that was absolutely rife. To my sorrow, I only read recently that extraordinary book by Paul Nizan, Les Chiens de Garde, which is, in case any of you watching haven't read it, which is your mistake, about the academic system in France. And Nizan is a quite strong and brilliant critique of the Kantian epistemology, or neo-Kantian epistemology, that characters like Freud, Wittgenstein, Adler, and others were fiercely fighting in the 20s in Vienna, and which people like Sartre were addressing, people like Althusser thought they were addressing, but in fact were simply repeating. And that has been a central goal in my thought. And yes, I would not have understood that without the French Revolution giving me that wake-up call. There's a wonderful line in a book by another person who was more or less Parisian. I'm referring to Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin. He says at one point, everybody sees the paradise, but then they see the angel with the flaming sword, after which they spend their whole life either saying it didn't exist and trying to forget it, or trying to get back in. If there's a third option, I don't know what it is.
Very good. So as someone who experienced the events and obviously has an interest in France, an ongoing interest in France, I would assume that you've kept one eye on how the story of 1968 has been told as the years have progressed. And I wondered if you had an opinion on where the current dominant narrative sits, and whether or not you think it captures the way you experienced the events of 68.
Et le seul, and the only weather that we know is the weather that we make. It's, I'm sorry, my tone is not very good. You're suggesting here that the narrative being made about May 68 would be something that professors make. And there I'm going to sidestep what strikes me as a kind of positivist trap. In other terms, what is the legitimate narrative? I'm much more interested in precisely the, what we might call the little thing that positivism is not equipped to deal with, which is what it doesn't want to talk about. So let's talk about what's not being talked about in the ways people talk about May 68. And I've already talked about them. Let's go over them. What are workers thinking? If you want to send me a bibliography of what workers are thinking, I'd love to read it. What was being done in the AG? What was being done in all this kind of organizing, which you still see day to day. I mean, you see it at Occupy This. I see it when my old friend has an Assemblée Générale des Locataires du Bâtiment. I mean, all of that is very much still about 68 because people consciously refer to it. Let's talk about something else, because as an art historian, I find this extremely amusing. The situ. That's just a press invention. Nobody knew that. Actually, if you really want to ask about the situ, why don't you, I can send you Vanegem's email. He's somewhere in Belgium practicing yoga. Well, hey, yoga's great. I hear that if you're upset about Trump, you should practice yoga. What if you voted for Trump and you? Okay, I mean, okay, let's talk about the BS being written about the C2E. Let's talk about the fact that nobody wants to see what the workers were about. These become interesting problems, I'm sure. I have to say that when I read it a little while back, I thought that Kristen Ross's book on 68 was very informative because, of course, I wasn't around hanging with, what's his name, the guy who writes about art, Rancière. Then again, about 5 or 6 years ago, Rancière threw up his hands over what was happening in the banlieue. That tells me all I need to know. Okay, now being who I am, I have to assume rationally that what Rancière writes about 68 or anything else, including what he writes about art, has to do with the fact that he's given up on the banlieue rather than the other way around. In the immortal words of Karl Marx, it's not enough, well, actually the reverse of his words, it's not enough for the mind to bend towards facts. Facts have to bend towards the mind. Okay, so
you've answered my question.
Good.
So the last thing that I'm going to ask you is something that I've asked everybody. If you were given 30 seconds to summarize your experience of 1968, how would you do it?
Now we're getting really into this kind of mystical, spell the truth while standing on one leg. How about just a lucha continua? Does that work for you?
Well, if that works for you, it works for me.
All right, let's do it.